Welcome to Roger That, a podcast presented by HVAF of Indiana. I'm your host, Lauren Carpenter, and join me as we discuss how HVAF is ending veteran homelessness and how you can join us in our mission. We'll be having conversations with community partners, staff members, and even some of the veterans we serve. We hope sharing more of our story with supporters like you can shine a light and give a voice to this vulnerable population, because no hero should ever be homeless. Before we get started with today's episode, here is how your support helped Hoosier Heroes last month. In September, 110 veterans received temporary housing and 229 veterans received rent and utility assistance to prevent them from becoming homeless. 11 veterans were enrolled in our employment services. These services include resume help, interview training, and job referrals. 239 veterans visited our pantry, where veterans received essential food, clothing, and hygiene items. And so far in 2024, we have served 1,198 veterans. And we know we couldn't serve this many Hoosier Heroes without your support. So thank you for donating, volunteering, following us on social media, and being a part of the Roger That community. So before we go any further, I want to give a trigger warning that this episode is about domestic violence. We will be discussing stats and experiences involving domestic violence. And if you are a victim of domestic violence, there is help. Please call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-SAFE, which is 7233, or text 88788 for help. October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, which serves as a call to action to end domestic violence in our communities. This awareness campaign is designed to educate, destigmatize, and empower survivors. In the last few years, the Department of Veterans Affairs has been addressing intimate partner violence among veterans and their families. The VA defines intimate partner violence as violent behavior by a current or former intimate partner that includes physical and sexual violence, psychologically aggressive or coercive acts, and stalking. Intimate partner violence ranges in severity as well as frequency, from a single episode to multiple occurrences over years. National data reveals that more than a third of women and men will experience intimate partner violence in their lifetimes. According to a 2022 report by the VA Office of Inspector General, between 14 to 58% of veterans have experienced intimate partner violence. 35% of female veterans have been victims, and active duty military and veterans are 3 times more likely to commit violence against their partners. HVAF administers a rapid rehousing and rental assistance grant from the VA called Supportive Services for Veteran Families, and this allows flexibility to serve victims of intimate partner violence even if the fleeing victim is not the veteran. We stand with survivors and are committed to ensuring they are safely housed and provided necessary support to maintain their housing. And on today's episode, we will first be speaking with Keisha, HVAF's therapist. She will share more about knowing the signs or red flags of domestic violence and how to ask for help. Then we will talk with Andrea, who is HVAF's Community Engagement Coordinator. She has lived experience to share and talks more about destigmatizing this important topic. We are proud of Andrea's bravery in sharing her story and her passion to use her experience to help others. Here are my conversations with HVAF therapist Keisha and HVAF Community Engagement Coordinator Andrea. Well, Keisha, welcome back to Roger That. How are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you. Last time we spoke in May for Mental Health Awareness Month. So we're going to go a little bit further into like the mental health world, kind of more specifically on, because this month is Domestic Violence Awareness Month. Probably, definitely an uncomfortable topic for people to hear, want to talk about, but I think it's really important. And I know you have a lot of expertise in this area, and that I think will be really important for people, even if they've never experienced it themselves, to be aware that other people are and kind of what, as listeners, what they can do to help. So I appreciate you coming on and being willing to talk about such a difficult subject. So what, I guess then, when you've provided as a therapist here, just any like observations, or maybe like if there's any like stats or anything on like kind of what domestic violence looks like in the military/veteran scape?
Okay. So just kind of observations I've made with some of the veterans that have come into my office is just really, it doesn't necessarily have to be female veterans. And I think that's kind of what our almost stereotype comes in, is that, females are going to be more prone to experiencing domestic violence. However, we do have a few male vets that come in. And the biggest thing is that when we think of domestic violence, we almost instantly think, there's got to be bruises or some type of physical, visible, damage to a person. And domestic violence goes so much more in depth because it can be emotional, it can be psychological, and it takes a lot of people time to recognize that those are actually signs of domestic violence, because while they're in it, they don't think that they think, well, because no one's putting hands on me, I'm not in a domestic violence situation. And so when I have some of our veterans come in and they talk to me about their previous, relationships, experiences, I start to pick up on those. So like, those signs that they have been in an abusive relationship. And then afterwards, I start to ask them about, how often has this happened?
Mm-hmm.
And starting to then educate them on what that cycle of violence looks like, and how to then later on down the road, if they're in another relationship, how do we recognize those signs early on so that, ideally we can get out of it as quick as possible.
Yeah, I think that's what you said. Like, I think a lot of people think it has to be the worst case scenario.
Mm-hmm.
That's like something I've experienced with my friends. If they talk about relationships, it's like, well, yeah, he hasn't hit me, or he hasn't punched, or whatever. But it's like, it could just be the way he talks to you,
Yes.
just even as simple as that. So if you could maybe kind of break that down of like, I guess like the definition of domestic violence.
So domestic violence, or what is, we also refer to it as intimate partner violence now. It is any relationship with, of course, an intimate partner, spouse, that can be physical, emotional, psychological, financial. The abuser tends to be very manipulative, threatening. They will isolate you from friends, family, and essentially make you feel as though you are the cause for these things happening, to where you have now become codependent on this individual. And again, it takes a really long time for people to recognize that this is happening to them, especially if it's not that physical abuse. And when I do, meet with our vets, and especially like our female vets, and they have reported that they've been in some type of, domestic violence situation, at times I do feel that some self-disclosure is important in order to build that rapport with them and let them know that that's a safe place. Like I get where you're coming from, because it took me a really long time to recognize that I, at one point, was in an abusive situation. And it took me years and a lot of therapy afterwards to recognize that the person I was with was manipulating me and abusing me, just in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
And that all the things that I thought were my fault were not my fault. And so by doing that, it also gives them that kind of safe space to recognize, the things that I'm about to tell you, you're not being judged after the fact. This is it's a supportive environment. And because of that, it also gives them a sense of hope that they can actually come out of this and be okay after.
Yeah, it's probably hard to admit too. You don't want to have to admit that, because it probably shows weakness, or,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to say that they have experienced this, because they do feel that there's, maybe a level of shame, or people are going to pity you. Mm-hmm. And nobody ever wants, pity from anybody. But it's one of those situations where you have to kind of take the bad and turn it into something good. And it can end up later being a strength for you. And that's what I try to tell some of our vets, is you can't look at this as though you failed. You actually are incredibly strong because you survived it. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people can't say that. So it shows a huge level of resilience on your part, that you were able to endure all of that and still come out on the other side.
Yeah, definitely. What are then some red flags that people could look out for? Not just veterans, anyone listening, of maybe, they're in a relationship, and maybe some early kind of signs to look out for those red flags.
I'd say if we're looking at, again, obviously if you're seeing someone that has bruising or anything, that's going to be a huge red flag. But, in those initial early stages of your relationship, some cues that either yourself or even if, say you have a friend or family member that's in a new relationship, things to kind of pick up on are, is this person not spending as much time with like friends or family as much as they used to? Are they starting to isolate? Are they always spending time with this new partner? Just any normal behavior, like, do they smile as much as they used to? Do they look a little bit startled or frightened sometimes when they never, used to do those types of things? Are they justifying why, if one of your friends is saying potentially like, hey, like, why can't you, go out with us or go out to dinner? And, they use that partner as an excuse. Well, why? Like, what is it about them? Have you met that, their new significant other? That's also very telling, because that is, one sign of somebody who's starting to then control that relationship is they don't want to meet the people in your life that mean something to you. And you have to wonder why they don't want to. Are their finances starting to look a little bit different? Did they used to have like money to go out and do things, and now suddenly, maybe they're paying for, their significant other's bills, and that's not a common thing. Just those little subtle, changes in a person's behavior, they do speak volumes.
If there is someone who has noticed this with a friend or loved one, thinking that they could potentially be in a, domestic violence relationship, what would be a good way for them to approach that person? Because I'm sure that they don't want to talk about that, they don't want to admit it.
Yeah,
so.
No, and you definitely, it's a hard area to broach because, of course, you never want to make the assumption and then cause potential issues, with your friend or loved one. But just really, touching base with them, checking in and just making sure like, hey, are you okay? Finding those little ways like, I haven't seen you around as often. Is there anything happening that I can help you with? Being that ongoing support for somebody it does speak volumes, because they're going to need that later on. When we start to feel that we have no other support other than that significant other, now they've really gotten a hold of us. And now we feel as though that's the only person we can rely on is our abuser. And so having that person, our friend, family member, reach out just periodically gives us that little bit of hope that, there's still someone there for me if this doesn't work. And a lot of times too, that can be that little bit of strength that person needs later to get out of that situation, is knowing that they still have someone that they can go to afterwards. Because when they feel like they have no one, that's when they tend to stay in those relationships longer than they need to.
So when you speak to survivors, in your therapy sessions, how do you help them through it?
The first thing is, again, there may be that self-disclosure where I may have to, show a little bit of my story as well. But really just letting them know what you've gone through is not your fault. Making them feel safe, making them know that, this support is ongoing, and trying to, initially understand like what is their experience, like giving them that opportunity to voice in their own words what has happened to them. And from there, just really, coming up with, if they need a safety plan, have that in place, because a lot of times we may cross paths with our abuser. We may be in a situation where we're fleeing, and, if they don't know what supports or resources exist in the community, making sure that they know. if they've been able to, successfully get out of that environment, but they still have those concerns, well, what if I happen to run into them because we have mutual friends? Okay, what's a plan that we can have to get you out of that situation as quick as possible if it does happen? I did at one point, I had one veteran who she escaped a very violent situation with her ex-husband, and they ran in the same social circles, and she was very concerned. She was like, I haven't seen him yet, but I know there's going to come a point where what happens if he shows up? And she said that especially like at church, they attended the same church, and I told her, she was close with a lot of the parishioners. And I had told her, like, they know of the situation. I was like, have a code word that you need. Or if they follow you, like say your abuser follows you and, you somehow manage to make a phone call, have a word or a phrase that lets that person on the other end know, I need help right now. I'm not in a safe situation. And make sure that that is known with all of your support networks. So that way someone can either call the authorities or get to you as quick as possible to get you out of that situation. And others, it's finding creative ways to help them heal. Because I've also had some people where, they say the abuser has, passed away, or they can't get that closure that they want. And everyone, how they get closure is going to look a little bit different. So, some people, they like to write things down. So we've done things where I've had them write letters to the abuser expressing all the pain, all the hurt, anger, everything that they want to tell that person that they can't. And I give them the option, and I tell them, I'm like, sometimes it can be a little corny, but it's actually very helpful. I was like, either burn the letter afterwards, and as you're burning it, make your peace with it. Or if you are more of like an expressive person, I was like, you can tie it to a balloon and just set it into the universe. And at that point, you have made that decision that you're forgiving them for yourself, because you'll never get the apology you want, but you have to forgive them so you can now forgive yourself and you can move on and heal.
Yeah. And there's a phrase I've heard, I guess, in the mental health world called trauma-informed care. So what is that first?
So trauma-informed care is our approach of recognizing that the person sitting across from us has experienced some type of trauma, whether it's childhood, military, in their adulthood life, they've had some type of trauma. And so because of that, we have to take that into consideration in our approaches with them. So maybe we might have to change the tone of voice that we use with them, or, make sure we don't startle them, our body language, anything that can potentially trigger someone. We have to keep that in mind, and that their trauma is going to shape the way their treatment looks. So it's one of those added benefits too of it's client or patient driven at that point. They get to feel that, this is specifically tailored towards them, because we can't treat everyone exactly the same, because they've experienced things, they've interpreted things differently. And so we have to make those adjustments based on their trauma.
Okay. So I guess kind of looking on the other side of it, we're going to be also talking with Andrea on this episode where she's experienced domestic violence in her household due to her husband's PTSD from the military, and they've sought out, therapy and care for that now. But so I guess have you experienced that other side where there's been a veteran who has caused the domestic violence, and maybe if there's what you've noticed of how maybe PTSD increases the likelihood of domestic violence?
So I haven't had anyone come into my office that has been the aggressor because of PTSD. But yeah, there's a ton of research out there now about the correlation between PTSD and domestic violence, especially untreated PTSD, because we have to recognize that when our, military, when they serve, they are experiencing highly stressful, highly traumatic situations, and they do come back changed. And so reintegrating back into family life, civilian life, it's not an easy transition for a lot of them. And when we have untreated PTSD, we are going to be, a lot of our vets, they're prone to nightmares, flashbacks, bouts of anger, irritability, substance use to help self-medicate. And all of those can contribute to developing aggressive or threatening behavior, in particular towards their partner, because that's the person who's home with them.
Right.
And I know the Harvard School of Medicine, they did a survey, and it was that 55% of military couples that are affected by PTSD have experienced a physical altercation at some point, which is, over half.
Yeah.
And so because of that, we really have to kind of keep that in mind. And, the VA, other community providers, they've all done a really good job of recognizing that, it is a little bit more common now. And because of that, there really needs to be an emphasis on the education and the supportive pieces. And so I do think in recent years, they have done a really good job of just providing, education while you're still in the military, while you're in that reintegration process of letting them know, hey, these are the signs and symptoms you need to start looking for when they get out. Ideally trying to get them connected to their local VA hospital so that they can get connected to those resources. And even the education piece for the spouses, because as a spouse, you have to know what to expect when, your husband or wife comes home. And there is a huge transitional shift because, you have your spouse who's been at home and is primarily the one who's running the household. So, their children, they're all in a routine. And now we have, our spouses come home and we're trying to re-navigate family roles and everything. And so when we educate the spouses as well of these are some of the things to expect out of, your husband or wife when they come home, and how to deal with it, who to reach out to help get them connected if they aren't already, definitely helps a lot. And now it doesn't fix everything, of course. And, we're still going to have those moments where, the PTSD goes untreated. But when we get those resources in place, they start to seek help, then of course those numbers are going to go down because now they can recognize why I'm doing the things that I'm doing.
Is there anything else, any specific measures or steps that you'd like to see be done either in the military or post military life to decrease domestic violence?
I think just, the ongoing education piece and making sure that there are enough resources in place. And I know that can be difficult because, if we have somebody who lives in a rural area, it's going to be a little bit harder for them to get those resources. But the benefit is, there's so many advances now where we have telehealth options and everything, just really making sure that each person knows that there is some type of outlet or support network that they can reach out to so that they can get connected to proper services. And just, again, remembering what those signs are so we can recognize it a little bit quicker so that we can go and get the treatment that we need sooner rather than later.
For someone who is listening and is not involved themselves in a domestic violence situation, or maybe someone they don't know, are not aware of someone close to them in that situation, what's something that you wish that they would know?
Just to remember that, again, it's not physical. There are emotional and psychological scars that run just as deep as any physical one. And so, again, just be aware of your friends and your family. When you see them acting different, especially if they've started a new relationship, check on them because somebody might not. And then you realize that it can progressively get worse. And it may start off as more verbal abuse and everything, but it can eventually escalate to something physical. And, we don't want it to have to end in that manner because there are instances too, of course, where domestic violence can end in fatality. And so if we see those signs in our friends and loved ones that they're not acting the same, just making sure, we know that, of course, nobody wants to butt into anyone's business, but sometimes we need to, especially if we're noticing that they're not acting like they used to. And just kind of by doing that and being more self-aware, it helps that person, and it even helps ourselves if we ever end up in a similar situation, because domestic violence doesn't discriminate. We don't, we never know when it's going to happen, who it's going to happen to, and we just all need to be as self-aware and educated as possible.
Yeah, and we've mentioned before in this that this is hard for people to talk about, to admit they're in the situation. Absolutely. Or just to want to talk about it at all. So what can we do to reduce then that stigma of domestic violence?
Keep talking about it, because we have to, and it's one of the things I tell all of my veterans, is you have to learn how to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. And you may always be uncomfortable with it your whole life. I mean, I tell people all the time, like, I never, even years later, I do not like telling people my story, but I have to look at it as a strength, not a weakness. And if my story and my experience can help another person, then that's all that matters, because I can at least make sure that somebody else doesn't experience what I went through, or maybe not as severe, and they got out of it a little bit quicker. So we have to keep talking about it, and that's the only way people are going to really start to listen and realize that, it's something that needs to be addressed.
If there's then a listener who, is a veteran, they'd like to see you for therapy, either on, this topic or just anything else, how can they reach out to you?
You can reach out through our main office. I know you'll post my contact information. Through the website, there's several avenues, or just come in and ask to be connected.
Yeah, and people can see you in person or telehealth.
In person, telehealth. For telehealth, it can be any person in the state of Indiana, and now in Ohio.
Awesome. That's great. Well, thank you so much, Keisha, for coming on and sharing more, shedding more light on this topic with our listeners.
You're very welcome.
So today on Roger That, we are joined by HVAF's Community Engagement Coordinator, Andrea. Andrea, how are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you. I know this is not the most fun topic to discuss. And definitely some things we'll be sharing that are, personal, vulnerable, all of that. But, we really appreciate you coming on and sharing. And if it touches even just one person, makes a difference. And that's what all that matters,
Yes. That's why I'm here.
Good. So first, we're talking about domestic violence. That's just Domestic Violence Awareness Month. People who are listening might wonder, why is our community engagement coordinator talking about this? So if you just, want to be able to share your story so our listeners know why you're here to talk about it.
Yes. So I am actually a survivor of domestic violence myself. My husband is a veteran, a disabled veteran. He came back he served in Iraq in 2003. Saw some really ugly stuff. Lost a couple really close friends while he was there. But the PTSD didn't really come about until 2009. So that was a second deployment. And even though that wasn't combat related, he had a near-death experience with an appendicitis. And so he was in the hospital for about 3 weeks. He had a really high fever. He nearly died. And so this kind of brought on some of the experiences that he had repressed that happened while he was served in Iraq. And so then when he came back in 2009 from the second deployment, he was a completely different person. He withdrew. He became very agitated very easily, and he became very paranoid. And the toughest thing about the situation was he wasn't sleeping. And so he would go days without sleep. And it was because he had night terrors of what happened and he was reliving it. But all of that is to say that he began to be abusive to me. It started as a mental and verbal abuse. And I honestly thought that like it would just get better. Like I knew something was wrong with him. He wasn't willing to admit or get help at the time.
Yeah.
But I just thought it would get better. But typical of domestic violence, it just continued to get worse. And I went through a lot of denial, I guess you could say, that I thought I could handle it. I thought I was protecting my kids from it. But it all kind of came to a head to where I had to get a restraining order because there was a weapon involved and my life was put in danger. And I just knew at that point that this was something that I couldn't control and I couldn't make better. But it was very hard because we had been married 9 years and we had 2 children. And getting the restraining order was actually one of the hardest things I ever did. But it was the best thing that I ever did because that was when he went and got help. But at that time, we were separated. The interesting part of my story, which isn't the case for a lot of situations, is that I'm very thankful because my husband got the help he needed, and we were able to have a second chance at our marriage. And we were separated for over a year while he got that help. And I kind of developed my own strength and got my voice back through that time that I had lost. So I think that's one of the hardest things about when you're a victim of domestic violence. You lose who you are. You lose your power and your voice and your own self-esteem. And it's hard to get that back. But I was able to through therapy and through a domestic violence advocate named Candy who helped me. And throughout that time, we then were able to reconcile. And he's continued to get the help that he needed. And we will be married 25 years now.
Wow.
This December.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, that's what I love about your story is that, there's a lot of hope in a happy ending and everything. So, so thank you for sharing that. And I know also before you were here at HVAF, you worked at a domestic violence shelter.
Yes, so that was actually the same it was the advocate from that shelter who helped me. So when they had opportunity for me to, a position had come up there, I felt like it was opportunity to give back. And, as a survivor myself, I was able to do groups and things with the other survivors. And it's amazing how, there's a wall until you say, oh, well, I've been through this myself. Then that wall can come down because you find that you trust and understanding and compassion that, may have not, that survivor may have not felt comfortable sharing. And it was a really special time in my life because there are a lot of survivors that I met that are near and dear to my heart, and they shared their stories with me, and they suffered way more than I ever did. But I was able to be just a listening ear for them. Not a therapist. I'm not, a counselor of any sort, but I just would sit there and listen. And, and when I had opportunity, encourage them, to keep going and to try to find their voice, like somewhat like Candy helped me.
Yeah, that's what I think is cool too is, obviously it was really hard what you went through, but it's, nice that now you can use that experience to help other people. So,
yes.
And even now you are able to use that experience, and helping with our veteran engagement committee and, serving those veteran families. So,
yes, when the job for HVAF came up, I always said I had 2 great passions in my life, and one was, helping domestic violence survivors, and the other was helping veteran families who also sometimes have domestic violence, and PTSD is involved in a lot of that. So,
yeah, for sure. So it seems like domestic violence is more prevalent in military and even like the post-military life than people would even realize. So, yeah, I know there's some stats you'd like to share on that.
yeah, I found these stats and it's kind of staggering a little bit. In 2022, the Family Advocacy Program received 15,479 reports of domestic abuse in the military. 68% of those incidents were physical abuse. And then the number of military couples affected by PTSD, more than half of those have experienced a physical altercation, and my family would be one of those. So I feel like the stats, that it kind of speaks to, domestic violence is an issue in this military and veterans.
From your experience and maybe like research you've done, why do you think that this is so prevalent and why it happens?
I think with the military there are some extra stressors. There are a lot of deployments, so that puts extra stress on it. It's more like being a single parent when the veteran is gone. Then when the veteran comes home, there's a readjustment period where you've been apart, and so there's those stressors. And then with PTSD, there's just a lot. It's a mental health, issue. So I can't speak for everyone, but my husband, he had a lot of anxiety, depression, suicide ideation, things like that. And when those things are happening, sometimes that can come out as aggression and projection on the spouse or the person that you're closest to, because that mental health needs to be dealt with, and lots of times those things are untreated, and so I think that's where you're seeing an increase in domestic violence. That's just my opinion, but
yeah. What would then you like to see happen? Maybe like higher ups in the military or something, could do like to prevent this from happening and lower these stats?
I think prevention is good, like, particularly addressing the mental health component, when coming back from a deployment immediately, which I know they've improved in this a lot from when my husband came back. But also I think talking about it, reducing the stigma, I think sweeping things under the rug doesn't help anyone. If this is a real problem, it needs to be talked about, and, programs implemented and therapy implemented on both sides, both for those suffering the abuse and those who are giving the abuse. It's both parties are suffering. I was always taught, hurting people hurt people. So both sides are suffering, and typically someone that's lashing out, there's a reason why they're lashing out, because they're hurting.
Right.
So I think just talking about it like we're doing today, is a good step, and educating people about the prevalence of it, but ignoring it or pretending it like it doesn't exist is definitely not helping the problem.
Right. Yeah. It's like something that people don't like to talk about. They don't want to admit that either they've been the person to cause it or they've experienced it. And so, but it's, like you said, though, that's the only way we're going to be able to get through it. And, is if we talk about it. What about a spouse, who is expecting their, their military spouse to come home? They're maybe nervous that something like this could happen. Is there something that, like, I'm trying to word it delicately because I'm not saying it all would be their fault, but like, if there's something that they could do to kind of, I guess, how they can navigate that together, so then the domestic violence just doesn't even happen.
Yeah, I think therapy is really good. Knowing that, being educated on, the potentials of these stressors, how to prevent them. For my husband and I, one thing that and it's very simple, but it's very effective, is is to walk away. Is we have a code word, like when you're angry, you just keep going at each other until one of you just, snaps. And I think that walking away from a situation to cool down is really good, whether you have a code word or just something that you do. But also getting in with the VA is huge. Admitting that you need help is huge. You can't fix anything if there's not a problem. So there's no stigma in admitting that you need help. And I think it takes a lot of courage, a lot more courage actually, to say, you know what, I don't have this all together. I do need help. And I think that is, as a spouse, I think that's really powerful. When my husband finally did that, that's when my heart softened. That's when I was able to go to him and say, okay, we can do this together. But if you never get to that point, there's nothing you can do. So I think that being willing to get with the VA, and if you need help, that's what HVAF is about, providing resources that, like a VSO, a veteran service officer, to help you get a claim in. But once you get that in, you can get therapy, you can get medication, you can get peer-to-peer mentoring, things like that are going to help. And then hopefully, in a marriage situation, the spouse is going to recognize the efforts and be sensitive to the fact that you're working through things. But if you say, well, it's not, I don't have a problem, then there's nothing you can do.
Right.
Really.
Let's say a spouse, is acting out, showing us like red flags to where it could lead to domestic violence, but then there's the veteran isn't like wanting to admit or doesn't realize that there is even an issue. What do you do then?
Well, I think, there are a lot of resources out there, domestic violence shelters, advocacy programs. One thing that I would encourage people, if they know someone who's in potential, or you can kind of see some red flags. The first thing that I would say is that, lots of times what runs through someone's head is, why doesn't he or she leave? Well, there are a lot of reasons why. There's some deep-rooted psychological things going on because of abuse, financial reasons, the kids, spiritual reasons, believing that marriage should stick together, all kinds of different reasons. And so you have to be careful to wait until that person is ready to leave, because they really need to have all their ducks in a row. The chances of someone dying in a domestic violence situation is at the highest when that person leaves the situation. So they really do need to have all their ducks in a row. So you can't, assuming that you know what's best for that person, you really can't. But I think being that friend that listens, that is there when they're ready to leave, that maybe can provide resources like a card or something and just hand it to them, say, hey, if you ever need some help, I know of this place and I'll go with you, is the best way. But I experienced both. I experienced shame and judgment because I didn't leave. Then I experienced shame and judgment because I did leave. Everyone has different opinions of what the best decision is, but only that person knows what's best for them. So presenting them with options is great, but don't ever judge someone because they haven't made the decision that you think they should make, because you really don't know what you would do in that situation, and also you really don't know what's best for them.
Right.
And so, and also that adds to their own psychological trauma, because they're already dealing with shame, low self-esteem, being told what to do. You want to empower that survivor to think for him or herself and to make her own choices, or his own choices. That's going to give their voice back. That's going to raise their self-esteem. That's going to give them courage to leave, if you give them that power. So that would be my recommendation as a survivor myself.
Yeah, no, that's great. And, someone who's listening who, has not been directly involved in a domestic violence situation, which thank goodness that they haven't, But what's something that you wish they knew?
The greatest thing, this was like a revelation for me, and to other people it may not seem like much, but one of the most powerful things that my domestic advocate ever, my advocate ever did for me was, she said, "What do you want for your life?" And I had that point never really thought about what I wanted. It was always like what everyone else wanted. And so it really empowered me. And that was when I chose to leave. That was when I got my master's degree. That's when I got a better job, because I realized that I had the power to better my life. So I think that if I anyone, whether it's in the military or civilian world, any situation, is that, anytime you can offer those kind of words to someone, what do you want? That's very empowering. And I just would encourage, to be that person and to listen. You don't even have to offer advice. Sometimes they just need a listening ear to know that someone cares and that they have someone to reach out to when they're ready to address the situation.
Yeah, and what can we do as like a community to reduce the stigma?
I think that talking about it is probably the best thing. Doing like what we're doing now. I love what the Colts have done with It's Okay to Not Be Okay. Like those type of things, the mental health that comes across the board, whether it's domestic violence or, and I think today's World Mental Health Day.
It is, yes. The day we're recording this, yes.
And also World Homeless Day. But anything we can do to educate people and to know that, it's okay to not be okay. That domestic violence is real. 1 in 4 women will suffer a domestic violence incident at least once in their life. That means that almost every person will come in contact with people who have had domestic violence in their history, whether they know it or not. I mean, think about that. Every person will know somebody who has had domestic violence. So I think it's about being kind and not being afraid to talk about the tough stuff, because that's going to reduce the stigma.
Yeah. Is there, anything else on this topic that you think we haven't covered? Something maybe just, another or a few other nuggets like that you just want our listeners to know?
The only thing I would like to say is to all those out there who have been hurt, you matter. You are important. No matter what he or she said to you, that is playing in your head over and over and over, it's not true. You matter.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the perfect way to end this. So, just thank you so much, Andrea, for coming on here and being vulnerable, sharing your story, and using that to help other people and those listening right now.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
I want to thank you for listening to today's episode. I'm sure at times it felt uncomfortable, but as both Andrea and Keisha said, it is so important we get uncomfortable and talk about domestic violence in order to end it. And I want to share again that if you are a victim of domestic violence, there is help. Please call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-SAFE 7233 or text 88788 for help. All right, that wraps up this episode of Roger That. Thank you so much for listening. If you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to Roger That on wherever you get your podcasts. And be sure to follow us on social media at HVAF of Indiana. And for even more stories on HVAF and the veterans that we serve, check out our blog on our website at hvaf.org. Thank you, and until no hero is homeless, we'll see you next time on Roger That, a podcast presented by HVAF of Indiana.